evening, everyone. My name is Claudia Ringler, and I'm the Director of Natural Resources and Resilience at the International Food Policy Research Institute. And I would like to welcome all of you for today's policy seminar on a new report that was recently published by the World Bank entitled Rooted in Biodiversity. The report is a collaboration between the World Bank, several CGIAR centers, and many, many other partners, and draws on research under the CGIAR Initiative on Nature Positive Solutions, which is now a part of the science program on multifunctional landscapes. What makes this report unique, and why are we meeting today? Rather than painting biodiversity as a victim or adversary of agriculture and food security, Rooted describes biodiversity's role as the key agent and ingredient without which agri-food systems and thus human life could not exist. It then lays out what all of us, depending on these biodiverse agri-food systems, need to do differently to ensure that agro-ecosystems continue to thrive from better conserved and restored biodiversity in the field, on the farm, in the landscape, in the region, and across the globe. As all these forms of biodiversity are and need to remain interconnected for agriculture to become more resilient, remain productive, and thus capable of providing a range of ecosystem services, not least among them, nourishing future generations. Following introductory video comments, we will hear about the main messages and recommendations from Rooted, followed by deep dives on linkages between agriculture and biodiversity and nature-positive solutions in support of biodiversity. This in turn will be followed by a discussion, Q&A, and closing remarks. Throughout the event, we also hope to hear from our audiences. To participate in our online Q&A session, please submit your questions on ifpri.org, Facebook, LinkedIn, YouTube, or by using the hashtag AskIFPRI on X. Without further ado, I would like to now move to introductory video remarks from Jo Swinnen, who is the Director General of the International Food Policy Research Institute.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening for everybody, to everybody joining this seminar today. Personal greetings from Manila, where I am at the Asian Development Bank headquarters today. I'm happy to welcome you to this session, which will highlight the findings, key findings from the World Bank report, Agricultural Rooted in Biodiversity. The report was prepared by our World Bank colleagues in collaboration with the team from the CGIAR and including several IFPRI researchers. Food policy agendas typically call attention to how agricultural and food systems are contributing to biodiversity loss around the world. This new report is very exciting and emphasizes a different angle, namely how biodiversity contributes to agricultural growth and also how agriculture can contribute to biodiversity through nature-positive solutions. IFPRI experts have supported their colleagues from the CGIAR and the World Bank partners in various ways. They have reviewed the economics of several options, several sustainable agricultural practices. They also assessed policy options for incentivizing nature-positive intensification, and they drew lessons from successful policy reform from case studies of successful reforms. Fostering a positive relationship between agriculture and biodiversity is a goal of the CGIAR science program on multifunctional landscapes. And I'm very pleased that today already we have several results coming out of the science program, which will be presented and discussed. Work on agriculture, biodiversity linkages and multifunctional landscape is important for the CGIAR as a whole. It is also fully in line with our new IFPRI strategy 2026-2030. Let me give you a few examples. Research on private financing for common pool resource management supports our objectives of fair and efficient markets. Studies testing invasive species management contribute to the theme of resilient and sustainable food production. Analysis of landscape governance is facilitating the goal of inclusive growth and transformation. And then more general, overall, our research and research with our partners on better policies and institutions and their interactions contribute to improved landscape management for more biodiversity and more ecosystem health. This is to fully integrate environmental sustainability into food systems transformation models. So congratulations again on the report in concluding, and I expect rich discussions on pathways to scale nature-positive agriculture and foster vibrant landscapes around the world. Thank you very much, and I look forward to the discussion.
Yeah, I think this was a really great set of introductory remarks, and definitely congratulations are certainly in order, I think, for this wonderful report. And to really understand the depth and breadth of the report, we will now get an overview presented by Peter Goodman, who is incidentally the lead author of the report. And Peter is a senior agriculture economist at the Global Department of Agriculture and Food, Planet Vice Presidency at the World Bank. Peter, over to you.
Good morning, and thank you for the opportunity to discuss the Rooted report, and many thanks to our colleagues across the CGI network for their contributions and background research that they did for the report. Let me just share my screen with you now. The reason we wrote the report was to...
Good.
The reason we wrote the report was to help us to more systematically integrate biodiversity outcomes into our investments and policy dialogue. As Claudia said, biodiversity and agricultural production are often framed as competing choices between conservation of natural areas and agricultural expansion, which it is, but we wanted to emphasize that biodiversity is really a foundation for the ecosystem services that support agriculture. And that if you think about it, biodiversity is kind of the lifeblood of agriculture. And we hope this will encourage ministries of finance and agriculture to invest in biodiversity to support agriculture. If you think about it, agriculture is really a modification of nature. And like natural habitats, agriculture depends on ecosystem services which are delivered most effectively by diverse ecosystems. So, for example, soil organisms do a better job of maintaining soil health. Diverse pollinator communities mean that when disease strikes, not all species are affected at the same time. You could also think of it like this. I mean, when biodiverse ecosystems are subject to environmental stress, not all of the species are affected equally, and they can draw from different resources to recover. You could also think of biodiversity as a kind of a multifunctional support system, multidimensional support system for agriculture, diverse genes and species and ecosystems working together. So imagine a landscape where you've got diverse genes improving disease resistance, while diverse habitats are reducing disease transmission. Simpler biological communities don't do this as well. They don't perform these services as well. So diversity is really important for agriculture. So let's now think about where the biodiversity that supports agriculture is. When we're thinking about when we're thinking about where to planning land use to maintain these ecosystem services, it's important to recognize that they're underpinned by biodiversity across the landscape, in local agricultural landscapes, but also in surrounding natural landscapes and distant natural landscapes that support climate regulation and water scales water cycles at a global scale. Conservation of natural forests is a good example. So natural forests host more diverse species. They have more complex root networks than monoculture plantations. And we now know that they're better at preserving soil moisture, which helps protect agriculture against drought. So we need to look at biodiversity in agricultural and natural landscapes to support agriculture. Let's take a look at the condition of those natural and semi-natural areas supporting agriculture. Recent research gives us a better picture of where the most critical natural assets are located. That is, areas providing biodiversity and ecosystem services, which if they were lost would have irreversible or catastrophic consequences, including for agriculture. We know that over half of these critical natural assets are still largely in their natural state, and their priorities for conservation. If you look on the map, that's the green and the yellow areas. But almost half of this area is threatened by potential agricultural development and or climate change. Here it's described as the areas that are unstable. That's the yellow area on the map. We also know that just under half of these critical natural assets have been degraded. That's the purple and the dark red areas on the map. And about 2/3 of these are threatened by potential agricultural development or climate change. And these are priorities for restoration. That's the dark red area. Now this better data, or this much more spatially specific data on these critical natural assets is now being helped to countries to plan conservation and restoration. And you can see that the extent and the condition of these critical natural assets is quite different in each country, as you'd expect. Now let's zoom down to the local level and look at biodiversity in agricultural landscapes. Research shows that we need at least 20% natural habitat in agricultural landscapes to fully maintain ecosystem services. We know that some services disappear completely below 10%. We also know that up to 1/3 of agricultural land lacks the natural habitats it needs to fully support pollination, pest control, and other services. Now, this doesn't mean that we need 20% natural habitat universally across all agricultural land. And with increasing land pressure, we need to identify where it makes most sense to restore natural habitats in agricultural landscapes from an economic as well as an ecological perspective. So you'd expect that, marginally productive areas, those providing connectivity to forests and those that protect rivers, obvious candidates in terms of delivering biodiversity and ecosystem services. So we talked a little bit about conservation and restoration. Now let's look at how we can make agricultural intensification more sustainable to reduce pressure on natural landscapes. So how do unsustainable practices actually affect biodiversity and ecosystem services? Scientists would probably tell me this is a slight oversimplification, but broadly, unsustainable practices like over-irrigation change the state of the ecosystem. They take the oxygen out of soils, or they change the flow of water. That then creates selective pressure on species, and the composition of species can change. Thirdly, you then end up with a less diverse or different biological community. And this changed community doesn't perform its role in climate, water, nutrient cycles as well. And finally, as a result, ecosystem services like maintenance of soils, soil health suffers, resulting in huge losses to agriculture. So we need to identify sustainable practices to address biodiversity with a solid understanding of these pathways. And these are some of the ones that the CGIAR colleagues looked at and are described further in the report. We need to make sure that these practices not only support biodiversity, but also increase productivity. Otherwise, we're just going to shift production somewhere else and cause more land use change. Many bundles of sustainable practices like conservation agriculture or integrated nutrient management do just that. But there are some challenges to scaling these up. And this table, with some examples from the literature, shows that some practices perform consistently better than conventional practices. Those marked in green, yeah, performing better than conventional practices consistently on a consistent basis, yeah. Another constraint is there's often a time lag before they return a profit or they have higher early investment costs than conventional practices. And this has several policy implications. Firstly, that we need to provide incentives to farmers to bridge the financing gap in the early years of adoption. And secondly, it means that we need to invest in long-term local research so that we can capture the long-term benefits and context-specific results. And we don't have enough of that research at the moment. So that long-term investment is important. So how can we finance supporting adoption of these sustainable practices? The financing gap for biodiversity is huge. Investment in 2024 was almost $1 trillion less than will be needed in 2030. This figure shows how the composition of agricultural support has changed. Repurposing agricultural support, specifically the 80% linked to production, that's the market price support in blue and the coupled budgetary support in green on this graph, which have incentivized a lot of land use change and unsustainable practices can help fill that gap. And indeed, we have a team at the World Bank working with countries to help repurpose that support. So going on to how are we going to use this work? What are the work streams we're going to try and develop to support biodiversity in agriculture? I'm just going to run through these briefly and happy to discuss them further. Fall into kind of three packages. One is to support spatial planning, both in natural landscapes to conserve those important natural areas, but also within agricultural landscapes, the natural areas within agriculture. That's a first area that we will be working with to support biodiversity for agriculture. The second package is trying to enable sustainable intensification for biodiversity. And these fall into three broad areas. The first is trying to integrate sustainable practices for biodiversity into our investment projects and scaling those up beyond the projects. That means looking at the science drivers of biodiversity loss. It means looking at the finance, at the economics, and then designing incentives, and then looking at those barriers to scaling up. A couple of narrower but important areas are looking at biomarket input development. We know that the global market for biofertilizers, biostimulants, and biopesticides is worth over 10 billion globally, and is expected to more than double by 2030. And we can support that growth by identifying countries' regulatory barriers to entry into this market, which is one of the various constraints to scaling up the bioinput market. We also would like to look at how we can support plant genetic resources for food and agriculture, biodiversity and cropping systems by seeing how we can support cooperation between community seed banks and gene banks to preserve genetic material that may not happen through the formal seed system. And I think Carlo's going to talk a little bit about that later. The third area is looking at how do we finance sustainable intensification, restoration, and conservation. We'd be looking at how to integrate nature into public expenditure reviews. Chris is going to talk Chris Kettle from Alliance is going to talk in a minute about scaling up payments for ecosystem services through the My Farm Trees platform, which we'd like to support. We're looking at how we can integrate nature into private sector operations and finance, and that's for several reasons. To help them obviously mitigate climate and nature risk. To help them access impact finance, to access regulated markets, and to make corporate reporting standards. Also, Pascal from IUCN is going to talk about some work that we'd like to do to support biodiversity monitoring. So if we can implement some of these measures across agricultural landscape, it's important to measure them so we understand the impact and provide a basis for that, provide a justification for that future investment in biodiversity. And IUCN are going to talk a little bit more about that. And this is just a summary of those work streams. Happy to talk more about those. So thank you very much. Thanks again to our colleagues at CGIAR across the centres for all their work on this. Back to you, Claudia.
Yep, thank you very much, I think, for this excellent overview. And I think it really provides a lot of opportunities for strengthening biodiversity intentionality in our agri-food systems and obviously natural systems related work and research. So if anyone has questions to Peter, please don't forget to put them into these various online channels and we will collate them for the question and answer session. We now have two more shorter, like kind of Ignite presentations that will provide some deep dives into some of those areas that Peter had touched upon. And for the first one, I'm calling on Tosin Somorin. She is a researcher on circular economy waste management with the International Water Management Institute. And she will explain to us why agriculture and biodiversity are not yet always on the friendly terms that we need them to be. Thank you very much. Over to you.
Yeah, thank you very much. I hope I'm audible. So I'll be building up on Peter's presentation and unpacking that question around how does agriculture drive biodiversity loss across landscapes, and where are the opportunities to intervene. And then this particular presentation is based on prior work that was done, an extensive scoping study that was done by HIMI and CGIAR partners on mapping the drivers and impact of agricultural-driven nature loss. So just to get into it, in our study, what we've done is to look at the key evidences, and then we gathered the key mapping of the global agricultural practices. Of course, these are the main global agricultural practices, and mapping them into 4 interactive agricultural domains. And this is highlighted on the slide. We have soil and land management, how water and water management is done, pollution management across board, and then looking at climate as a cross-cutting factor. In our study, we have identified 10 major agricultural drivers and 16 sub-drivers, but in the slide on the left, you will see there are 10 major agricultural drivers, and these are mapped into these 3 domains that I mentioned. We looked at we used the DPSR framework, which is to link or to provide these causal pathways, so tracing how specific agricultural activities act as drivers, and how they generate pressures, how they alter ecosystem states, and then we look at how they impact biodiversity and ecosystem services. And the focus on ecosystem services are the regulatory ones specifically. Now, what our synthesis showed is that biodiversity loss is not driven by a single factor, but by interconnected processes. How we use water, how we manage water, how land is transformed and intensified. I think Peter mentioned bio-input, how input and waste are managed across these landscapes, and how these activities interact with the ecosystems creating interconnected pressures, often reinforcing each other and also being amplified by climate. So what does these interconnected pressures look like? So I'll just probably just cite a few examples. So for example, we can look at maybe agricultural water use, particularly large-scale irrigation and over-abstraction of water from the aquifer or from surface water bodies. And what we see, the impact you see, or the alteration you see on the environment or the ecosystem is first is about altering the natural hydrological flows, which disrupts river connectivity, degrades wetlands, making them isolated habitats. And then it reduces environmental flow generally, and that we can link that to loss of aquatic habitat and species. We could also cite another example from land conversion and intensification, where there is massive deforestation leading to soil degradation, and that can be linked to high impact of vegetation loss and simplification of the environment or simplification of habitats. And that in itself also causes habitat fragmentation, reduces ecological connectivity, and that also reduces species loss and genetic erosion overall. We could also take the lens from this from the high of pollution, right, and look at the excessive use of fertilizers, pesticides, and poor livestock waste management in general, and how that links to soil and water contamination, often promoting toxicity, eutrophication of water bodies, bioaccumulation across the food web, and how that disrupts ecosystem function at that species level or even much wider. And that reinforces the idea that the difference of sustainable agricultural practices that we've identified create pressures and they alter ecosystem structure and function, and they lead to pathways, and these pathways, they do not operate in isolation, they interact, they reinforce one another across landscapes. Another key point from our study, we're looking at how agriculture is affected by climate change, but also looking at how agriculture is a contributor to climate change through emissions and land use change. And we see this compounding effect, so a compounding effect of climate even on biodiversity. So for example, we can look at water systems. So we see due to global warming, there's variability in rainfall, altering hydrological flows, and that is increasing pressure on irrigation. So you find more farms irrigating because of that. In land system, we can talk about climate stresses accelerating soil degradation and driving expansion of agriculture into new areas. We could also look at it from a pollution perspective, where warming temperatures also increases toxicity and runoff in rivers, and that also stresses the ecosystem that is already in distress. So we see these sort of like reinforcements of agricultural activities with climate and aggravating the effect on biodiversity loss. I guess the summary from this presentation is that biodiversity loss cannot be solved by a single interventions. We need system-wide solutions. We need solutions in investments, interventions, which are integrated and are applied across scale. So I'll pass this over to you, Claudia, or to Chris, who will take this forward to Nature Positive Solutions.
Yeah, thanks so much. This is really an excellent overview of all of these interconnections that, as you already said, Chris Kettle, who is our final presenter, and principal scientist and lead tree biodiversity for resilient landscapes. Lead at the Alliance of Biodiversity and International, and CIAT will basically talk about now, moving really from the overview and interlinkages into the action space. So Chris, over to you, please.
Great, thanks, Claudia, and I hope you can see my screen correctly.
Not yet.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Sorry. Now you can see it.
Yes.
Okay, great. I'm going to be very quick because I know we've only got 5 minutes, but I'm going to try to build on Peter's presentation and Tosin's presentation very specifically to focus in on the idea that scaling nature positive bundles of activities depends on how well we can tailor these to local context. And importantly, in this sense, how do we do this in a way that delivers immediate value or benefits to farmers and not just long-term environmental benefits? And of course, we often talk about scaling solutions, but landscapes, especially agricultural landscapes, are fundamentally different across the different regions of the world in which we want to prioritize nature positive solutions. They differ ecologically, they differ socially, and they differ economically. And it's absolutely critical that we bundle and tailor these solutions to meet those contextual situations, including making sure that these bundles of solutions are legitimate in the sense of the presence of the governance and the policy within these landscapes. So it's very clear and not rocket science that one size clearly does not fit all in the context of nature positive solutions. And so within the synthesis report that fed into the Rooted report presented by Peter, we identified 4 really critical typologies: forest frontier agriculture, chemical intensive agriculture, intensive livestock agriculture, and water extractive agriculture as key contextual entry points. And then, as Tosin has highlighted, we then looked at how those different drivers within those typologies through water management, soil and land use management, and pollution and waste could be addressed through innovations. Peter started to list these very explicitly. For example, micro irrigation or land watershed management using agroforestry, intercropping with multi-purpose trees, and sustainable manure management or integrated pest management with biocontrol. All of these bundle together and need to be developed in local context. And so within the synthesis report, we really highlighted how this could be done in a way using local, spatially explicit information, and how this can be adapted to ensure that ultimately we're addressing the problems through solution bundles that can not only impact things like global biodiversity framework targets, but also national action plans and the needs of farmers. And because I've got so little time, I'm going to focus very specifically on a concrete case of how we've been doing this with smallholder farmers in Cameroon and Kenya through a system of My Farm Trees, which is designed to incentivize the increased growth of native trees in agroforestry and farm trees with smallholder farmers. And this delivers a whole range of different ecosystem service benefits, as you can imagine, through the fact that the farmers grow tree species that will not only lock up carbon, but also improve soil health, enhance pollination services. We've done this across across 6,000 smallholder farmers in these 2 countries. And we've been using the platform not only to co-develop with farmers their strategy of integrating trees onto farm, but also to ensure they have the capacity to select species that are going to deliver their immediate benefits, and crucially receive payments for those services they're providing through these nature positive interactions or interventions. And so we've paid over $500,000 in payments to these smallholder farmers through the use of the platform. And this is directly, immediately leading to benefits where farmers receive payments they can then reinvest into sustainable nature positive agricultural practices, improve their local livelihood conditions, and start to even become entrepreneurial in new nature positive business models, such as propagation and sale of native trees for other farms to be growing through nurseries on farm. And this all contributes directly to increased livelihood benefits coupled with more productive and sustainable nature positive agricultural interventions. So with that, I'd like to thank you very much, highlight that this is from the synthesis report, and hand over back to you, Claudia.
Yep, excellent. Thanks so much. It's really always good to, have some successful examples that we can, draw on to really make the case with governments and also, I guess, World Bank task team leads. So that's really excellent news. So following these presentations, we now move into the discussion section of this event, and I would like to first call on Pascal Bonsomme, who is the Global Head Food and Agriculture Systems at the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, IUCN. Pascal, the saying goes that we cannot manage what we don't measure. Something that Peter has also referred to. I remember a picture of, actually several maps that looked incredibly interesting. Can you tell us, what you're doing in this area and how monitoring land health helps scale up some of those nature positive solutions that we have heard about today already? Thank you. Over to you, Pascal.
Absolutely, Claudia. Thank you very much. And I also want to say thank you for having me on this exciting webinar. So I also want to say that it's really great because we signed an MOU with CGIAR about a couple of weeks ago. And the collaboration with the World Bank is excellent. So thank you very much. And indeed, as Claudia said, we cannot manage what we don't measure. Hence, if we want to scale up nature positive agriculture, we really need to measure credibly and consistently what is changing in the landscape, for whom, and with what biodiversity and production outcomes. So that is where land health monitoring really becomes essential. So we define land health as the capacity of land relative to its potential to sustain the delivery of ecosystem services. So this concept moves beyond short-term productivity and considers the long-term ecological functionality of landscapes. Land health is grounded in the interdependence between above ground and below ground biodiversity, which drive key ecosystem functions. It is also grounded in habitat quality and connectivity, which supports those functions across space. And it is grounded in resilience and multifunctionality, allowing landscape to withstand shocks and delivers multiple benefits. So to go back to the question you asked, Claudia, I would like to make 3 quick points. First, monitoring land health helps move the conversation from intentions to evidence. So many stakeholders now agree on the need for nature positive agriculture, but adoption at scale still depends on being able to identify baselines, to track change over time, and to demonstrate that investments and practices are actually improving ecosystem functionality, biodiversity, and the resilience of productive systems. So monitoring provides that evidence base. It makes nature positive agriculture more actionable and more accountable. Second, monitoring improves policy and program design and implementation. So not all landscapes start from the same point, and not all interventions are appropriate everywhere, as we just heard from Chris. So if we want to scale efficiently, we need spatially explicit and context-sensitive information that helps identify where degradation is occurring, where biodiversity functions are being lost, and where interventions can generate the greatest benefits. So monitoring helps prioritize action, tailor bundles of practices to local realities, and avoid one-size-fits-all models of scaling. This fits very well with the broader discussion today, I think, and we're going to hear more about multifunctional landscapes later. So the land health monitoring framework developed by IUCN is particularly relevant in this regard because it operates across multiple spatial scales, from field level to farm, to landscape, and to national level. So this matters because scaling up nature positive agriculture is not only about what happens in one plot or one farm, it is about understanding how changes at lower levels contribute to broader ecological functionality, land condition, and decision-making across territories. So by linking these scales within one coherent monitoring logic, the framework helps connect field realities with farm management, landscape planning, and broader policy and reporting needs. This makes it easier to identify where interventions are working, where bottlenecks remain, and how local improvements can be aggregated into a clearer picture of systemic change. And in that sense, the multi-scale nature of the framework is itself a scaling tool. Monitoring is also what allows policies and programs to understand what improves land health at scale and to learn and adapt. So my third and final point is that monitoring is essential for unlocking and directing finance. Financial actors need credible metrics, traceable results, and a basis for verification. So without monitoring, it's very difficult to distinguish between claims and demonstrated outcomes. With monitoring, it becomes more feasible to channel financial flows towards interventions that are restoring landscape health, reducing ecological risk, and strengthening long-term productivity. So just to sum up, land health monitoring matters to scale nature positive agriculture. It offers a practical way to assess agricultural landscapes, not only in terms of production, but also in terms of ecological integrity and functional biodiversity. It helps create a common evidence base that can be used by practitioners, governments, projects, and financiers alike. And that common evidence base is what allows scaling to be more strategic, more credible, and more aligned with biodiversity and climate commitments. Thanks, and back to you, Claudia.
Yep, thank you very much. I think really good to know and learn about all of those functions of monitoring, and also obviously, good to know that this is now, I guess, much more feasible than it used to be. My second question goes to Wei Zhang. She is a senior research fellow with the International Food Policy Research Institute and also a contributor to the report. So Wei, you undertook literature reviews and I guess other things, but specifically focus on your literature review focused on the economics of sustainable agricultural practices for biodiversity. What were your key findings, and what are the implications of those findings? Digging a bit deeper into the economics here. Over to you, Wei.
Thank you, Claudia. Yeah, I really enjoyed the collaboration between the CGIAR and the World Bank. Let me build on what Peter has presented a little bit and unpack the economic evidence a bit. So as we know, understanding how sustainable agricultural practices perform economically, financially, relative to conventional practices is crucial for informing policies and investments. Our synthesis study was motivated by the fact that the evidence on the economic performance of sustainable agricultural practices is highly scattered. So my colleague Upeksha Hathiarachchi and I undertook a systematic review of primary research articles published in the last 20 years to compare the economic performance of about 15 single practices and 4 bundle practices identified as sustainable and biodiversity positive with conventional practices across a range of economic and financial indicators, including, for example, benefit cost ratio, profits, cost, benefit, yield, input use, net present value, internal rate of return, payback period, and finally some indicators related to factors of production such as labor. So in terms of overall performance, more studies reported improvement across economic indicators than losses as compared to conventional practices for most of the practices that we assessed. And practice such as agro-silvopastoralism, crop rotation, climate-smart agriculture, and improved seed varieties consistently outperformed conventional practices in terms of profitability and revenue on, return on investments. So we do see that local conditions such as farming systems, farm size, climate, and geographic locations, they matter in terms of the economic outcomes. Inspecting across the practices, we found that yield is the most frequently measured indicator, appearing in 70% of the studies reviewed. Profit and revenue are also commonly studied. Most sustainable agricultural practice that demonstrate positive economic or financial returns with financial indicators like profit, benefit cost ratio, net present value, internal rate of return, generally favoring sustainable agricultural practices. Costs varied widely by the type of practice and the type of cost, and also the stage at which the costs were incurred played a role in the outcomes of cost of sustainable agricultural practices. So some key takeaways. Sustainable agricultural practice present trade-offs in terms of high upfront investment costs and time-lagged returns. So they generally have longer payback period, lasting between 2 to 8 years, as compared to conventional practices. While high upfront costs could hinder adoption, profits often exceed conventional systems once adopted in the long term. So policy support is really critical to help farmers overcome the financial barriers to adoption. We also identify some evidence gaps of, including, for example, the temporal period that needs to be strengthened, and labor intensity, for example, has been shown to increase with adoption, but rarely was studied in the literature. Coverage of studies is also uneven across geographies and practices. Additionally, more evidence is needed on the comparison between sustainable and conventional practices. So my final point is establishing the evidence base to inform investment and policies is crucial. We need more longer term and local context research. Thank you.
Okay, thanks so much. I think very insightful findings, and actually good to know that there is now a body of research to even support this kind of analysis. Also, thanks to everyone who has already submitted their questions. So feel free to add more. Again, you can do it through IFPRI.org, Facebook, LinkedIn, YouTube, or by using the hashtag AskIFPRI on X. So we move on to our final panelists. I'd like to call on Ryan Nearing. He is a research fellow with the International Food Policy Research Institute, and was also involved in the report. So Ryan, what are some innovative policy reforms that countries have undertaken in support of more biodiverse agriculture based on your contributions to the report? Over to you, Ryan.
Thank you, Claudia. I should mention, like Wei did, that this was a collaborative effort, and I worked with Ritwik Ghosh, who's at the North Carolina State University, and Sally Sen-Yang at the University of Denver on some of our policy and investment reforms. And we looked at 10 of them in 9 different countries. So a lot of them are innovative, and we selected them for a reason. We cast a pretty wide net in looking at some of the ones that we ultimately did a deep dive into. But I think there's 2 worth mentioning, and one is broadly on community-based natural resource management. And I'll pick one in particular, but I just want to stress that this particular type of reform or policy of community-based natural resource management is important for 2 reasons for biodiversity and agriculture. One is that access and ownership over resources is the bedrock of sustainable biodiversity conservation, and ultimately who has productive resources and under what conditions is therefore fundamental to achieve desirable outcomes when it comes to agricultural biodiversity. And secondly, as Chris Kettle mentioned, and also Wei, context is key. And so we felt the need that such an important type of reform or policy is important to have a diverse set of cases to then look at how context shapes different ways to approach community-based natural resource management. So we have cases on water in Peru, coastal ecosystems in Mozambique, forests in India, and land and wildlife in Namibia. Really quickly, the case of Namibia, and I believe that those reports will be shared, so I encourage you to look at all of them. But if you're interested in Namibia, that particular case ratified the Constitution that allowed for specific types of community access, ownership, and the use of natural resources, specifically also including wildlife, which in the case of Namibia was fundamental to support livelihoods both through tourism, but also sustainable subsistence use of wildlife in the country. And so taking all these together with having a constitutional amendment and then also providing for provisions that allowed for the flexible use of community access and ownership over natural resources was really quite interesting in the case of Namibia. And the second one, in just about 30 seconds, this is a case in Colombia. And so as a part of this work, we also developed a series of policy recommendations and a trade-off tool. The trade-off tool in particular looked at punitive or compensatory sets of incentives built into any particular policy. And one of the cases that we then focused on is recent in Colombia. It's called the Fund for Life and Biodiversity. And it does a great job, at least in theory, because it's so new, there's not a lot of evidence on it. But the fund itself creates both a sort of punitive set of incentives because it creates a fund by establishing a carbon tax that finances the fund. And then those funds itself are used specifically for projects and policies in Colombia on biodiversity, many of which have a very explicit goal on reducing agriculture's contribution to biodiversity. So those are two. Again, we did 10, and I believe they will be up. Many of them are in CG space. Thank you.
Okay, excellent news to really see, these success stories or developing success stories. Now moving from impact on the ground and success at national level, I'd like to call on Carlo Fada. He's the Director Agrobiodiversity at the Alliance of Biodiversity International in CIAT. And he will tell us, based on his many decades of experiences and also obviously strong contributions to this report, how all of this biodiversity is supported and is permeating key global processes such as the Convention on Biological Diversity. Carlo, over to you.
Thank you very much, Claudia. You make me feel really old with those many decades of work. I think that goes a little bit into even more details of what does it take to have nature positive systems. I think that it's very important that we understand that there is one part of the biodiversity spectrum that is highly underutilized, and that is agrobiodiversity. And it's probably also one of the most discussed topic. There is an international treaty on plant genetic resources where it plays a role. There is a convention on biological diversity. It is mentioned in many adaptation plans for the COP-CCD, the climate change COP, and yet there is very little action at the end on the ground. And I think the reason for that is that the system, that it's very difficult. It's a little bit kind of challenging topic to address. And yet we have a lot of tools and methodologies and approach that we can use to actually provide the farmers with genetic resources and seeds that are actually well adapted, disease resistant, that requires less inputs, and so they can contribute to the broader scope of reducing damaging input for the biodiversity. They can probably better perform under the agroforestry system and in intercropping with trees. And so there is a really a number of solutions that we could use about that. Maybe some numbers before we go into that. FAO seems to accept that 70% of plant diversity that was in the farmer fields has declined. Of course, there are literature that change a little bit or challenge a little bit the numbers, but still, what is quite relevant is that this diversity is declining. We also know that tree crops make up to more than 50% of our calories, and that is also a problem for hunger and malnutrition related to lack of micronutrients. So what I would like to highlight today is one way that we need to use in nature positive system. It's about stewardship, it's about engaging with communities, it's about making sure that the farmers actually have what they need and they can take decisions by themselves about what to sow and what to grow. So one is obviously the community seed banks. The community seed bank is one approach that the multifunctional landscape program is embracing strongly, that has been spearheaded by the Alliance of Biodiversity International and SEAT over many times. And we have multiple evidence that, in fact, this approach works. One way to look into it is, for example, through citizen science. Let the farmers decide themselves. And we have a number of methodology to do that. And after many years of implementing community seed banks and farmer-led seed system, we can demonstrate that it is beneficial for adaptation, for income, for promoting gender equality, for empowering women and marginal groups, and to really recognize the importance of indigenous people and their traditional knowledge in providing sustainable solutions for agriculture that will reduce the negative impact of agriculture. The next question is, so if we have this solution and if we have these tools, how do we make it operational? What are the tools and solutions globally that we can use to scale up these approaches? Well, there are several, and as I mentioned, it's a very broadly talked topic. So, for example, the benefit sharing funds of the International Treaty on Plant Genetic Resources is one. But then I think more broadly is the Global Biodiversity Framework, or the Kunming-Montreal Biodiversity Framework of the COP-CBD, which in a number of targets highlights the importance of biodiversity-friendly solution, and obviously agrobiodiversity is part of that equation. And so probably what needs to be done, though, is to make sure that the funds for the Global Biodiversity Framework actually go to support programs that increase agrobiodiversity on farm and in the field. And I think that this is still a little bit weak in the current structure. And hopefully with the upcoming GEF9 replenishment, which is the new funds that are going to go in for the implementation of the CBD, this can be strong. So I guess that what needs to be done is to have global programs and of larger scale that emphasize the importance of agrobiodiversity and promote the tools and methodologies that are already available to ensure that it can really thrive under the production system and make production more nature positive. Thank you so much.
Yep, thank you so much, Carlo. And that was definitely not linked to age, but it was really linked to your incredible set of experiences. So really good to hear from you. Now we come back to Chris. He has already mentioned some examples from the ground, and yeah, it would be good to now hear just a bit more details on, how to scale bundled biodiversity solutions, and how are they being co-developed with farmers and partners on the ground. Over to you, Chris.
Okay, thanks, Claudia. And I guess I want to talk about three really critical components. First of all is this co-development that ensures relevance, the right solutions for the right farmers, and how we develop technologies that really are delivering on the ground. And this is fundamental to this is really working together from the beginning. So really making sure farmers' perspectives are taken in from the very beginning, but we are also integrating this in the landscapes with those farmers. So we're ensuring the right species choices, we're integrating with the right management practices, and with those local livelihood priorities. And this is where digital innovations can really come in terms of capturing that local context, in terms of monitoring, things like Kobo Connect are already being used for farmer preferences. We've done lots of work within the Nature Positive Initiative and the multifunctional landscapes now, with really understanding that socio-ecological context of the farmers to how we can then adapt the nature positive bundles to deliver and be tailored locally. And so this is really enables us to be able to recommend the right crop tree combinations in the right places with the farmers. And these digital tools don't replace co-development, they make it really scalable as well, because we can scale the delivery of extension services, for example. The second is in the context of the bundling needs to deliver immediate value. So we can present as many bundles of solutions as we like, but if they're not going to be make it worth the farmers now, then it's very hard to see those bundles adopted by farmers. And adoption in the short term really needs to show income, risk reduction. And for example, with the My Farm Trees program, really those farmers receive immediate benefits, but they're also through payments, but they're also receiving the trees that can potentially deliver things like fruit or forage or fodder in a very quick turnaround time, even if some of those are future values. And again, the role of innovation here is to ensure farmers are linked to things like seed systems and nurseries, or have better knowledge on markets that are available for non-timber forest products. And then again, the direct payments, which, as we've heard a lot about today, is absolutely critical to seeing the transition to nature positive agriculture. So in that context, My Farm Trees really helps turn restoration into a livelihood opportunity, not a cost for the farmers. They can not only receive income from doing things like community managed forests, which will deliver seed or seedlings to nurseries, but they're also receiving incentives to grow trees that are going to increase their diet diversity, improve nutrition, etc. And the third point, which I think Pascal really emphasized importantly, is about that scaling requires visibility, trust, and finance. And we need to make these scalable solutions investable. And the big bottleneck there is in scaling these solutions is tracking performance, as Pascal said, and building that trust and linking the finance. And I think one of the real strengths of My Farm Trees is its ability to do all of those things. It provides the verification of what activities the farmers are doing in terms of growing those native trees. It's immutable using a blockchain platform, and it links directly to those finance payments. And of course, we have an increasing array of blended finance solutions that can be used to address that payment system to farmers as well. So the role of innovation, in my view, really is essential there in providing the traceability, that monitoring capacity, and the credible data for incentive payments. So I think My Farm Trees allows us to co-develop locally, deliver value immediately, but also to really scale those kind of technologies to transition agricultural landscapes to be nature positive.
Yeah, thanks so much, Chris. Good to hear again about this very successful example. And you did mention payments and finance, and Carlo also did. And of course, Peter already mentioned some big funding gap. And so that gets us to our last panelist before we are moving to the Q&A section. So, you know, we all know people root for biodiversity, but action requires financing. And so my final question does go to Astrid Agostini, who is a Senior Advisor, Climate and Environment at the FAO Investment Center, and also a contributor to the report. Yeah, I guess the question is quite simple. Biodiversity finance falls far short of needs. What role can biodiversity credits play in bridging this finance gap? Over to you, Astrid, please.
Thank you very much, Claudia, for this invitation to participate here. And you already mentioned that the financing gap has been highlighted before by various speakers. And of course, in order to generate all this work and be able to deliver on all the different activities here, we need the financing to make it happen. And this falling short of global requirements is also particularly high when it comes to private finance. So far, biodiversity finance has really been, the predominant flows have been from public finance. But actually also for private finance, we know that there's the risk of biodiversity loss and ecosystem collapse, for instance, is a major risk to global supply chains. And in fact, agribusinesses, of course, are particularly affected by this. When we're looking at growing private financing, one key aspect, though, is about actually greening the existing financing streams. And that's particularly about a mainstreaming of biodiversity risk management into the common financing solutions and financing the greening of agricultural supply chains. But just managing the risk alone is not sufficient, and we also need to look at targeted finance for biodiversity outcomes, and that's specifically where biodiversity credits come in as one innovative finance mechanism that's attracted some attention. And of course, the idea is to ideally unlock new private capital, especially for restoration and conservation. Now, we don't actually have a common definition of biodiversity credits, even though it's mentioned in the Global Biodiversity Framework, but there's some convergence about what it is really about as a measured and evidence-based unit of positive biodiversity outcome that's durable and additional. But the outcomes can be diverse. It can be about uplift, improvement in biodiversity, or avoided loss, or maintenance of biodiversity levels in the view of threats. And here already we see the complexity, whereas in carbon markets, we have a common metric for greenhouse gas warming potential in terms of CO2 equivalents that can underpin a global market. We don't have such equivalents in the biodiversity outcomes, and this segmentation, in fact, means that there has to be the market design, the claims and MRV requirements have to actually match and mirror this complexity and the diversity. The actual levels currently are very low in terms of biodiversity credits, just single-digit millions. It's a very thin market. It lacks transparency as the credits are generally traded over the counter. And there is these integrity challenges that are, or the requirements for integrity that still have to be met. So where we see the particular challenges are actually on the demand side. One thing is to supply the credits, but there's no much point in generating them unless you find a buyer. And the demand has really been lagging behind expectations in terms of corporate buyers. And one key to unlock this is to have greater clarity on the claims that buyers can make in terms of accounting for credits and purchase of credits. And this clarity has to come from the corporate transparency frameworks, the science-based targets and the disclosure frameworks, but also, of course, government regulation can be an incentive here. Another big challenge is monitoring, reporting, verification. We've already heard about this from several speakers. So here, again, the diversity is key. There is a lot of innovation going on, but it's complex and it is costly, and it is absolutely essential to underpin credibility of the credits. So how can this be done? We don't currently have sort of established market governance bodies that can guard integrity and reputational risks, but there's some initiatives such as the IAPB framework for high integrity credit markets that has put forward a framework for looking both at the demand and the claims side, focusing on contributions to nature goals and also saying no to international offsets, and on the supply generation, really looking at credible outcomes, fairness and good governance. They also run pilot initiatives, and this is somewhere where we can get some illustration of the diversity of different interventions from conservation in Kenya in terms of grazing lands to protection of coastal habitats in Mozambique, urban forestry in Rio de Janeiro, or sustainable farming in the UK. It's a really very diverse set of pilots that are currently coming forward and looking at showing impact and lessons to further upscale. So in terms of impact overall, though, we know that while there have been some estimates of potential multi-billion-dollar market potential, in the short to medium term, biodiversity credits are very unlikely to present any significant financing streams. And in the short run, it may be therefore particularly important also to look at the links with carbon credits. We know that in many projects, especially in agriculture, there is potential to also generate positive biodiversity benefits on carbon market opportunities, carbon projects. and that there are also in the market already some price premia for carbon credits that generate biodiversity co-benefits. There are also some interesting opportunities to learn from biodiversity credit initiatives in terms of innovation. We've seen this also from carbon markets, where we've assessed carbon markets for agri-food, that the innovation in the credit markets, looking at MRV, but also new solutions to achieve outcomes, can also then provide some very interesting benefits to inform broader investments and policies across the board. So while the biodiversity credits themselves are certainly not a silver bullet, it can be an important part of the puzzle, or a useful part of the puzzle, certainly to grow these overall financing flows to deliver on the many important things that we heard need to be done today.
Okay, thanks so much. Yeah, I think really, I hope, that all this information on how to get access to finance can be bundled, put on some platforms, and maybe it is. So yeah, let's maybe hear a bit more about that, but really great to know that the FAO Investment Center is deeply engaged in that. And I would now like to have cameras on for all of our participants today. We got around 20 questions, and I'll try to read 3 to 5. And I have to say, in many cases, I don't specifically know who to call on. So please, maybe don't raise your physical hand, because I can't see all hands the way the screen is currently set up, but maybe the screen will be changed so I could see possibly all physical hands, but otherwise, yeah, just you can also put in the chat which questions you can answer. So I'll start with the first set. We have Payman Pazuki, a postgraduate researcher from the University of Kent, England. He would like to just better understand what is meant with sustainable agriculture. So I think that was mentioned in Way's review, but also others talked about that. He wants to understand if sustainable agriculture practices consider regenerative, agroecological, permaculture, IPM, FFS practices or others. So yeah, maybe put in the chat who will answer this one. The second question is from Cedric Earl de Antic, an undergraduate student from Cebu Institute of Technology, University of the Philippines. He would like to know, have there been any efforts in integrating indigenous knowledge systems and agrobiodiversity? And I think Carlo did refer to that, and so maybe he can expand on that further. Then we have Simon Torres, working with the Latin American Model Forest Network in Costa Rica. He would like to know if environmental governance platforms can support, and how they support the implementation of nature-positive agricultural systems. And the last question for the first round is from Joseph Kagoro from the Uganda Meat Producers Cooperative Union. He would like to know, how can we more effectively integrate livestock production and productivity investments to offer nature-based solutions for transforming biodiversity in landscapes? So basically, yeah, we've heard a lot about trees, so let's hear a bit more about livestock. So please, yeah, if again you who feels strongly about answering the livestock question can go about that. So yeah, it looks like Wei will start with the sustainable ag question, and then Peter on livestock, and we'll get to all of them. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So I'll try to answer the question regarding the sustainable agricultural practices, how we define them and identify them. So our search included agricultural practices, management approaches, and technologies that are considered environmentally sustainable and nature or biodiversity positive than conventional alternatives. So the search was pretty generous. So in generally, we identified 15 single practices and also 4 bundle practices. And yes, so biodiversity and nature, environmental sustainability is, inclusion criteria. So if a study only that looked at agricultural practices and economic performance without any consideration of nature or biodiversity, we would not include that. In our bundle practice, the definition was a little bit tricky. We grouped them into 4 according to the title of the paper, so we respect how the authors define them. The papers that had climate smart agriculture, organic farming, conservation agriculture in their titles were grouped into 3 different categories. And papers that studied practices which were primarily biodiversity enhancing and biodiversity friendly were grouped under conservation-minded bundle.
Okay, great. Over to Carlo on the indigenous knowledge question, please.
Thank you. That's a very important question, I think, and of course we have many examples, but it's at the root of working on agrobiodiversity. The diversity that has been generated over the many thousands years since domestication has been done by using traditional knowledge lenses, selection based on cultural preference, taste, resistance. So it's a combination of human selection and natural selection. So obviously, when we talk about this genetic diversity or the traditional crops, they're all rooted on traditional knowledge. And that's why we have our work rooted with completely embedded in participatory action research approaches, which has a full inclusion of farmers. Maybe if I need to pick an example from my personal history, I would select the one from the durum wheat case in Ethiopia. Durum wheat is an indigenous crop of Ethiopia. It has been used for the past 4,000 years, and then it was threatened by the promotion of bread wheat, and it has been going under enormous loss of genetic diversity, which was fortunately conserved in the Ethiopian Biodiversity Institute Gene Bank, and so where they have over 6,000 different type of accession. So we started by understanding the adaptation potential for these accessions using modeling based on location of origin for these varieties. And then we took 400, that was kind of what we call in jargon a microcore collection, representing the diversity of the durum wheat in Ethiopia. And we started working with the farmers in selecting these varieties. And we start with 5 grams from each of these accession. And now, just to make the story short, is that, well, first of all, the farmers really like it. They're not used to scientists going and talk about what they have, but rather going and try to replace what they have. So it was already very exciting to have the farmers. But now what is happening is that over about 1 million farmers in Ethiopia are using these traditional rescued varieties that have been selected totally with the farmers and using completely the scheme that the farmers use for what is important and what is not. And what is actually the last point that is really important is that trigger a portfolio approach. So multiple varieties are selected because when you have a traditional crop, it has multiple use. It could be used for local drinks, it can be used for bread, it could be used for injera in the case of Ethiopia. And so different varieties perform better this different function, and the portfolio approach is also advisable, as the economists here would confirm. Thanks.
Yes, they do. They seem to confirm. Great. Quickly on the livestock questions, biodiversity in livestock systems. Peter, I think you can answer that.
Yeah, just quickly. So I mean, often livestock kind of gets left to one side and out of the conversation. It's usually discussed, obviously, in the context of beef driving land use change, deforestation, and eroding that biodiversity in natural areas. But it's much wider than that. And the team did look at some of the livestock practices that are driving biodiversity loss. So, I mean, an obvious one which has widespread consequences is on pasture management. both in terms of the soil in those pastures and the diversity within those pastures, but obviously also a basis for, sediment washing off downstream and having impacts on aquatic ecosystems further down. But we're also important in relation to waste management, manure management, and impacts on water quality. So the study did look at some of the livestock practices in relation to that. Another point, which I think is one which really falls off the radar usually, and is important, as I think Carlo mentioned, was the importance of diversity in animal genetic resources, particularly in terms of having that genetic potential to deal with shocks, disease shocks, or climate shocks in future. And I understand, from colleagues at FAO, there's just simply a lack of data in some countries on what genetic resources are there. So there's some very basic work to be done on the genetic side, just understanding what diversity we have, which is probably better understood in crops than in livestock. But yeah, we should certainly not leave livestock out of the equation.
Okay, great. Just then quickly from Chris, this environmental platform question in Costa Rica. Any comment based on your platform? But very short, because we'd like to get to a couple more questions.
I'll keep it really, really short. I mean, I don't think it necessarily relates to the My Farm Trees program, but I think what's critical here is that nature positive agriculture needs to be embedded at the landscape scale, and we really need to have these governance structures that enable not only to bring the stakeholders together, but to increase transparency and accountability. And so having landscape scale governance, and indeed in the multifunctional landscape science program, we're using this vision to action approach where we bring all the stakeholders together to make a visioning exercise of what the landscape should look like to deliver multifunctionality. And I think that's really critical. So.
Okay, great. I'll just now pick 3 more questions. There were a lot of other questions questioning, that end users, farmers, how can they really benefit from any incentives for biodiversity, and also how demand, this came across at least one audience member felt there were a lot of supply-driven suggestions, and how can we create demand. So I would like, all of you in the last 30 seconds commenting on that. Are we really reaching poor farmers or not? And how can we generate demand? But before the questions that I picked directly for Pascal, Timothy Mahoney would like to set up a monitoring system. Do you have like a starter kit for people to take this on? Dr. Celia Josea would like to understand how innovative extension systems are picking up these results. And third, we have Stephen Gravezand from Guyana. For Peter, how is the private sector, involved in putting your results into practice? And very, very, very short responses. Let's start with Pascal, please.
Yeah, thank you, Claudia. That's the $1 million question. No, we don't have a sample monitoring template. I think, there is no one size fits all. That's the idea. So the framework really, in fact, takes you on a journey to select what makes sense in terms of what needs to be monitored. It helps you clarifying the purpose of the monitoring, documenting what already exists in terms of information, selecting things like ecosystem typology, selecting the priority ecosystem function services, actually, and the key species of the targeted areas that you may want to look at, and then develop the monitoring protocol with indicators at different levels. So that's at this point, you get your template, but you need to go through this process first. So do take a look at the resource we will be sharing with you, so you will see how the framework works and how actually you can get to such a template. Thanks.
Excellent. Thanks so much. On extension and dissemination of these results, and extension, really the meaning is, to ensure that farmers are aware. Ryan, if you could just make provide some quick remarks on that.
Yeah, sure. And I would also just like to reference Kristen Davis, who's our colleague at IFPRI, who's the specialist in this area and part of this project, but was unable to join. So I encourage specifically the person who asked the question, but others to look at her research on extension. The one thing I would say quickly is that a lot of the extension models tend to focus on information deficits, right? So the idea that we need to either provide the tools for farmers to generate information or data that would then inform their decisions, or we as researchers or extensionists need to generate that data and disseminate it to the farmers. While that might be a problem in many areas, I think a better focus on shared learning and more on the process of extension, whether that's farmer-to-farmer networks or farmer-to-farmer sharing, or also more participatory approaches to extension, where, for example, a lot of the things we focus on with community-based natural resource management can be integrated into other incentives or information systems through extension. So it's not just one source of extension, but embedded in a broader bundle that I know Chris and Wade also talked about.
Perfect. Okay. Yeah, just quickly to Peter, private sector in one sentence.
Yeah, just quickly on the private sector. I mean, how can we get more private sector finance in? I mean, firstly, removing the negative incentives which cause private sector to invest in unsustainable practices, obviously. Secondly, creating the foundations for valuation of these ecosystem services and the systems for monitoring results and verification so that they can impact finance. But also thirdly, trying to help companies integrate natural capital accounting into their own operations and strategy to help them mitigate some of these biodiversity related risks, as well as, you know, access some of the regulated markets like the UDR, which are trying to address biodiversity loss, and you know, access impact finance. So it's partly about addressing the negative incentives, partly it's about trying to improve valuation, and thirdly about actually integrating it into the private sector's own operations and strategy.
Okay, great. Yep. And rather than asking everyone, would like to ask Tosin, because it's a while ago that we've seen her on screen and heard from her. So are we really reaching the poorest right now with the existing instruments? I mean, just really your impression. Thank you.
I think generally there's a lot of targets on smallholder farmers, and I guess the question is whether it's meeting the scale of the challenge. Obviously, the drivers are very interconnected, and so the solutions has to go beyond what it is right now. We have to do more.
Yep.
I think it's maybe in short summary. Yeah.
Short, and I think great answer on that. And with that, we unfortunately have to cut short, or not cut short, we have to end our Q&A session because we're very close to the end of the event. And I would like to now give the stage to Dr. Lulzige Desta. He's the director of the CGIAR Multifunctional Landscapes Research Program or Science Program, and he will provide us with some closing remarks. Over to you, Lulzige, please.
Thank you. Thank you, Claudia. Thank you, colleagues. Hello all. Thanks for giving me this opportunity. So they're very exciting discussion, presentations, questions and answers. I enjoyed them all. What we have learned from today's discussion is very fundamental. We know most of the time there are some who think that there is a dichotomy, a difference, or an misalignment between biodiversity and agriculture. It is very difficult to optimize one against another, so they have to be together. So it appears that for so long, agriculture was intruding into the biodiversity system. But now I think we are learning a lot, trying to see how we diversify our ecosystems, our agricultural lands, to make them more resilient, productive, and sustainable. So in that area, I think the most important entry point is to define or develop solutions that can help us address these critical problems of optimizing between conservation, restoration, and sustainable production. There are opportunities now. We have nature positive systems, agroecology, regenerative agriculture, which can enable us to achieve these targets. And I think these solutions are very timely now, considering the current issue crisis in the Middle East, where we have this conflict. Fuel cost is skyrocketing, transportation may be difficult, so input supply may be a challenge. So transitioning towards these nature positive solutions may be an ideal entry point now to maximize. And what is mentioned is also about contextualizing, tailoring solutions, because as Chris indicated, we cannot fit everything into one. So tailoring is contextualizing very critical. We have a long-term research experience in agriculture from the CGIAR, for example, and other partners. We have a lot of experience from the conservation side, from a lot of partners, including IUCN. Now we are trying to do is to bring this together so that both can sustain. How to do and where to do is also very critical. I think the critical points, entry points to do this in a sustainable manner are landscapes. These are where there are a lot of interactions, material flows, process flows, and so on and so forth. So there are ideal situations or places where we can optimize these interventions. And also, in general, our knowledge of processes and landscapes is more limited compared to what we know at farm and even at global scales where you can scale easily. And then the key point here is also partnership. It was very nice to see, the CGIAR, IUCN, World Bank, which are featuring together in a collaborative way where we can achieve a lot. And the tools, the instruments, the incentives, the governance, policy incentives that are mentioned are also very critical. So the way forward is, again, partnership, collaboration, and coordination. Thank you so much for the time. We have the West program to support this addressing. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much. Wonderful closing comments, and especially partnership, collaboration. And sorry, I lost the last word, but it fit perfectly together, which we needed for Rooted. And with that, I'd like to close, I think, this wonderful event today. And you should be seeing on the screen the next set of upcoming IFPRI policy seminars. Please join us for future events, and all the slides will be shared, and you will be able to find them online. And there should also be a recording of the event. So thanks again to everyone for joining us today.